believe it or not, after all these sins that I've recounted, I'm very much of an optimist that we can recover. We just need people to step forward, and it's got to be a bipartisan
Mm-hmm.
recovery. That there's, without any doubt, every poll I've ever seen,
Mm-hmm.
we have about 80% of Americans who want to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're not ideologues. They need leadership. They need a program. They need a strategy to recover, and so that will happen sooner or later. Hopefully sooner, so we don't end up in a shooting war.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Admiral Jamie Fogo, Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy. Welcome to a special edition of Maritime Nation. Today we mark a truly historic milestone, the 250th birthday of the United States Navy. For 2.5 centuries, our Navy has stood as a pillar of American strength, innovation, and resilience, protecting our seas, supporting our allies, and advancing peace and stability around the globe. It's a moment to reflect on the extraordinary legacy of those who've served and to look ahead to the challenges and opportunities that lie on the horizon. On this special episode, we're honored to feature Dr. Steve Wills in conversation with the 65th Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable John Lehman. Now, arraigned before me are all of the books that Secretary Lehman has written in his lifetime that contribute to the literature of the maritime domain. And there's some special books in here. But to start with, the first book that he wrote was The Aircraft Carrier, Real Choices, followed by one of my favorites, Command of the Seas, and On Seas of Glory. Finally, Oceans Ventured. Oceans Ventured is a special book to me. It was published in 2018, and I was asked to write a review for the book. When I read it and I look back at all the exercises and all the things that took place that contributed to the very famous maritime strategy of 1986 and an almost 600-ship Navy, I was thoroughly impressed. And at the time, I was the commander of Allied Joint Force Command in Naples, Italy, for all of the southern flank of Naples. We were going to do an exercise up north, and it was going to be big. 50,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, 70 ships, including the Harry S. Truman and the Iwo Jima Strike Group from the United States of America, 270 aircraft of all type model series, and 10,000 tanks and rolling vehicles that were going to converge on the country of Norway in an Article 5 scenario to push an adversary out of the high north. This book was the blueprint for that exercise, and after I read it, I started to make some changes. How we used the Harry S. Truman and how we pushed up into the high north like we did during Secretary Lehman's day in the Cold War. It was highly effective and sent a very important strategic communication to anybody that would even think about attacking a NATO ally. The other important thing is, from the strike group commander on down on the Harry S. Truman, not one person had crossed the Arctic Circle north of 66 North since the end of the Cold War. And so it was a great training ground. It was a really tough environment, but you have to train like you fight. And the bottom line is that today, Dr. Wills and Secretary Lehman will explore the Navy's storied past, discuss the lessons that continue to shape our maritime strategy, and the vision for the Navy's future. It takes me back to one of my favorite quotes from George Santayana, and I paraphrase, "Those who ignore the lessons of history that are in these books are doomed to repeat them." So let's dive in.
Good morning. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Stephen Wills from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. This morning, you're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to delve deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States Navy as a sea power on the global stage. We'd like to have a special thanks to our sponsor for Maritime Nation Season 4, Dataminr. Thank you, Dataminr, for sponsoring us. Today's guest perhaps needs no introduction, and he may speak about that later on, but you might have an idea based on the books that are arrayed in front of us here. We are honored today to be joined by Dr. John F. Lehman, Jr., the 65th Secretary of the Navy from 1981 to 1987 under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And he's the perfect person to have a discussion with about the Navy's 250th birthday. John Francis Lehman Jr. was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in September 1942. His father was a U.S. Navy civilian industrial engineer who ultimately obtained a rank of lieutenant commander in the Second World War, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. After he graduated from high school, Dr. Lehman entered St. Joseph's College and graduated with a bachelor's degree in international relations in 1964. He went on to receive a master's degree from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. While he was at Cambridge, he spent 3 years in the Air Force Reserves, but in 1968, thankfully, he left the Air Force Reserves and accepted a commission as an ensign in the U.S. Navy, where he ultimately advanced to the rank of captain in the Navy Reserve as a naval aviator. While serving in the reserves, he also served under the National Security Council and as director of U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. In January 1981, while serving then as president of the Abington Corporation, Secretary Lehman was nominated for the position for President Reagan's administration. During his tenure, as you might know, he did a lot of things, supported the idea of building the 600-ship Navy to rebuild the fleet after the post-Vietnam War cutbacks and as a counter to the emerging Soviet naval threat. He also developed what would become later known as the Lehman Doctrine, which was a plan for a forward military response to Russian invasion of Europe. Dr. Lehman, who was a reserve naval aviation officer while serving as secretary, was also a principal advocate for the resurgence of the fleet, including its aircraft carrier force. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. His support for the 600-ship Navy, promotion, and extreme good advocacy for the U.S. maritime strategy, also the reactivation of Iowa-class battleships, all these things together as a means of overcoming localized Soviet superiority by bringing the fight to their doorstep. Secretary Lehman left his position in April of 1987 and went on to do a number of other things, including founding J.F. Lehman Partners in New York, where he is the founding partner and chairman. Many of you know he served on the 9/11 Commission after attacks on the United States, and the future Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, USS John F. Lehman, DDG-137, is named in his honor. He's the author of many books that you see arrayed here in front of you, including Command of the Seas, On Seas of Glory, Oceans Ventured. He's also the co-author with yours truly of Where Are the Carriers? U.S. National Strategy and the Choices Ahead, about ideas for future U.S. Navy medium-sized carriers, but also the enduring potential and value of the flat top in a variety of roles. And we are honored and delighted to welcome you after that introduction to Maritime Nation today. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks, Steve. After that thorough introduction, I'd like to cede the rest of my time to you. I like the subject.
Thank you. All right. So to celebrate 250 years of naval history, we thought of no better person to have this conversation with than Secretary Lehman. And in fact, when the Navy was officially founded on October 13th, 1775, one of its missions was to protect colonies' ports and trade, but also to intercept Britain's own merchant vessels. U.S. Navy, Continental Navy at that time, was never able to establish much in the way of sea control, but it could fight a guerrilla warfare at sea against the most powerful maritime nation of its time. John, your own family has direct involvement in this period of naval history. You've written about that extensively, especially in a recent U.S. Naval Institute piece called Remembering My Sea Daddies. Could you tell us a little bit about your ancestor, George Lehman, and his fight at sea in the Revolution?
Well, sure. Unfortunately, it's hard to really track to get the complete factual history of American privateers, which privateers are legal pirates, basically. It's long been a part of international law that if a sovereign government issues letters of marque and reprisal, that they are legally allowed to capture and sell in a prize court in a neutral country the commercial ships and military ship or naval ships of their adversary. So that really in the War of Independence was one of the most important things that enabled us to win independence, because this came to me having been an ardent student of American history and naval history, particularly. I was doing some research in the archives of Lloyd's Insurance in London, and there they have the logbooks of 2,600 British merchant ships that were insured by Lloyd's and captured by American privateers. There were something like 1,700 American privateers, and they were not exactly totally separate from the Continental Navy, because, for instance, the privateer that my fourth great grandfather George Lehman served on, he was very close friends with, and the ship was captained by Stephen Decatur Sr., who was a captain in the Continental Navy. And so, since there were so few ships authorized by the Continental Congress, most, or not all, but many of the officers in the Continental Navy, having no ships, went to sea as privateers. And Stephen Decatur's father, Stephen Decatur Sr., did both during the war and was a great naval leader. So unfortunately, my fourth great grandfather, well, he did fortunately get very rich as a result of his ship, Decatur's ship, capturing, the ship was, by the way, Fair American, model of which is readily seen in the various museums, and especially the Naval Academy Museum. But the Fair American captured 29 large merchant ships and took them to neutral ports and had them condemned and auctioned. And so he and all the other members of the crew got very, very rich for those times. Unfortunately, he stayed at it too long, and on his third voyage, he got captured by the British frigate Gardenia. And after spending a month in those hellish British prison hulks in New York Harbor, he was taken back to England to be exchanged or otherwise kept out of the war. Well, as all officers, most of the naval officers were when they were captured. And so as soon as he got there, he bribed his way out within a few weeks. And there, by that time, this was 1782, most of the Brits and the powerful members of Parliament were totally against continuing the war. It was only George III who did. And basically, so many of them had been bankrupted, or the syndicates. They were what they call names, because all of the capital for Lloyd's Insurance came from private individuals, very wealthy and usually members of Parliament. And so basically they said to the king, either you stop this war or we're getting a new king. And so that was why reluctantly George III finally agreed to start negotiations. Well, George Lehman lived happily in London in a neighborhood called Shepherd's Market in Mayfair, because he didn't want to risk getting captured again. And so he stayed there, living large. And when the Treaty of Paris was negotiated by Franklin and others, he then took ship in a much more comfortable ship than he had been in, and went back to Philadelphia, where he lived happily ever after, and happily had children who had children who had children who had children until my father was a direct descendant, and I to him. And so that was the first of my sea daddies. But my great grandfather was in the Union Navy during the
Mhm.
Civil War and served very successfully. And and my dad was in Okinawa. He joined in 1944 and was a 90-day wonder, as you know. The ratio of Annapolis graduates to reserve 90-day wonders, they called them, OCS graduates, was as 1:70. So
Wow.
he was one of those 90-day wonders, was given command of an LCS, which was the most heavily armed ship in the war per ton.
Mhm.
Was in the Battle of Okinawa under attack by kamikazes for 100 straight days, and shot down 5 kamikazes, his ship,
Pretty good.
and then spent a year, then was in the initial occupation force into Tokyo Bay, and then he had enough points to be rotated back to the U.S., where he was mustered out and resumed his civilian career. And then I was born right before he joined the Navy. I joined the Navy when I was able to, and was able to go to flight school, which is a longer story than we could tell here without a few more hours. And uh, and my son John the third was also a 90-day wonder at Pensacola. Got his commission, went through flight training, was an ECMO on EA-6Bs, Prowlers. Did 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, and then went back to civilian life. And that's a long story too, for another day. So it's been a family tradition. It's a naval tradition in the family, but no one has ever gone to the Naval Academy or really spent a career in the Navy. But it is a part of naval history that most people don't know about.
Well, it's a fascinating thing, and just a couple of quick observations to your great 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 grandfather's vessel, Fair America, a sort of like a sports car of the age of fighting sail. It was called a snow, and this is a vessel that could deploy a whole lot of extra sail. And as I remember reading someplace, the British liked this ship so much after they captured it that they desired to reproduce this type of vessel based on Fair American's design as some sort of a dispatch vessel for high-speed transits between fleets. So it really had an impact on naval architecture, certainly for the Royal Navy.
That's a very good point, Steve, because they were designed specifically as for privateers, because privateer was built to carry a lot of crewmen so that they could put them ashore, put them aboard the prizes to take them into the court. Heavily armed for a relatively small, but above all, they're built for speed,
Yes.
to be able to outrun British frigates who were doing the blockade duty. So they were basically fore and aft rigged sails rather than square rigged. But they all had at least 2 courses of square rigging, so that they could maneuver if they got into a fight.
Hmm.
They could go at high speed, but then they could come to a complete halt almost instantly and change course. So they're really a beautiful ships, and many of them were built in Philadelphia. At that time, actually, the Americans had better naval architecture generally for merchant ships, and especially for combatants, as those of us and those of you will read six frigates.
Hmm.
Uh, the British copied when they were able to capture the one of the six frigates, they put it right into service, and it served in the Royal Navy because it was the best frigate design and built with a wood that was not available in Europe. That is the live oak, which was almost bulletproof. Basically, they were the first armored ships. So it's a fascinating story of naval history.
It absolutely is, and your family's been associated with sort of these civilian designs that get militarized. I believe your Civil War ancestor fought in a ship that was either a quick build or it was a conversion, a double ender vessel that could quickly be converted and used in many roles on rivers and coastal areas as well.
Yeah, that's correct. But they were basically New York ferries
Ah,
back and forth to Brooklyn. And there ended up being 80 of those double-ender steam
amazing.
gunships, and they were very effective in the Riverine War in the South.
That is a great story. But let's keep moving.
Unfortunately, they weren't very well armored, and he got blown up on the James River with a British torpedo. What they call it? They called it torpedo, but it was really a galvanic mine.
Fine, yeah.
And luckily, he survived, as only six survived from the explosion. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. But it's an interesting part of naval history.
Excellent. Let's keep moving forward with your family's history and you in this case. Did your father's naval service influence you in any way? I mean, after all, you started in the Air Force Reserve at one point, right?
That's true, but my dad was always my hero. I mean, he was offered. They tried to convince him because he never lost under the, you know, the Battle of Okinawa. We lost more sailors in that one battle than in the entire previous history going back to the revolution. But he was able to not only save a lot of lives in rescuing the Porter when it
Yes.
was hit, and he got a Bronze Star, and so they wanted him to stay in the Navy. He was offered a direct career commission, but he'd had enough, and he said thank you, but no thanks, and he returned, and he was really a great family dad. He was there at all of my baseball games and all of my sister's piano recitals, and he was there for dinner, and we couldn't ever really get him talking about his naval service until later. I got a little older, and if I could get a second martini down him, then I'd start to get the stories, and he really had quite a few to tell.
That is super cool. And that seems to be a common occurrence with many veterans of the Second World War.
Mm.
Um, but moving ahead, once you moved over to the Naval Reserves, there's a story there too that Arleigh Burke convinced you that you were in the wrong service and needed to come over to the light side as opposed to the dark side.
That's true, and really, if there'd been an opportunity, because I went to St. Joe's for undergraduates, and St. Joe's was my dad's school, and he was very loyal to it, but it only had AFROTC. It did not have Naval ROTC, so I didn't have the choice, and I really wanted to fly, and in those days, you had to take at least the first year of ROTC, whichever it was.
Yes.
So they got their grips into me, and I was headed for pilot training there. But in my commissioning, I went 4 years through our Air Force ROTC. But in commissioning, my commissioning physical, they said I was colorblind. So And now by the way, my wife agrees with the Air Force, but I did not. And so I went over to the Navy, took the Navy flight tests and flight physicals, and they said my color vision was perfect. So there was no, and as I really wanted to join the Navy anyway, and my dad, of course, also was strongly in favor of that. So, but I happened to meet and get to know Arleigh Burke when I was in college, and he is certainly one of the greatest of heroes. But he's a guy that spent his life after running the Navy as CNO for 3 terms, mentoring kids and in effect really recruiting. And so he told me that I should change services. Although the Air Force was great, and they kept trying to trying to get waivers so I could go to flight school. When I was at Cambridge, I was the lowest enlisted rank, an airman 3rd class, which they don't. It was so low that they don't even have them anymore. So, but they were great. And when I suddenly had to go back to the U.S. to get my final interview for commissioning, it was easy to get a hop back on one of the aircraft going back from Lakenheath Air Force Base, where I did my drilling and so forth. So then I went to Pensacola and got commissioned, and here I am, a retired captain.
But you also did a number of other things too, and you ended up in the Office of the National Security Council, working for the late great Dr. Henry Kissinger. How did you get to that role? We've been tracking you as a naval reservist. How do you get into the political side?
Well, to oversimplify a complicated story, when I finished Cambridge, I got a BA, and then later, if you're a good boy, you pay £10 and you get an MA. So I came back to Penn. At Cambridge, I studied under some of the greatest geopolitical minds and writers. And my director of studies, my tutor was Ellie Lauterpacht, who was a great international lawyer. So there was no doubt that was where I wanted to spend my career. And so when I came back, while I was at Cambridge, I applied for the PhD program at Penn, at the University of Pennsylvania, because they had the Foreign Policy Research Institute with Strauss-Hupé and associates like Kissinger and so forth. So when I came back from Cambridge, I went to Penn and the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Strauss-Hupé was a very strong influence on me. That's where I met Henry Kissinger, and I met others like him, but he was a strong influence. And when he was appointed later, and the Foreign Policy Research Institute was both Democrats and Republicans, but very much in the pro-defense. And Strauss-Hupé had written the book called and coined the term geopolitics. And so he was an advisor to most of the Republican candidates for president. So through that, I got to meet Dick Allen, who was Nixon's national security advisor, and he was also an associate at the Penn Foreign Policy Research Institute. And so when Nixon won the election, they appointed Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor and Dick Allen as his deputy national security advisor. And both of them knew me, and they had to put together a staff immediately for the transition up at the Pierre Hotel in New York.
Mm-hmm.
So I was invited to come up, and before I knew it, I was one of the first 4 employees or horse holders or bag carriers of the senior Kissinger and Dick Allen, along with Larry Eagleburger, who later became Secretary of State. And so that was my beginning of association with Henry, and it was he really is one of my definitely one of my sea daddies. He was a navalist down to his toes. He'd been an infantryman in the war. He'd been in the first wave at Normandy. He was decorated. He got a Bronze Star for heroism during the Battle of the Bulge. But instinctively, he was a navalist. And I remember during the years when I worked for him, I was present in the background as a horse holder for many of the crises, the first crisis. And every one, either Kissinger or Nixon would say, as soon as they were briefed on the crisis, like the shooting down of the Navy EC-121, where are the carriers? And, that was just instinctive. And so Henry believed our Navy was too small, and occasionally we had the chance to talk about it. And so he was definitely one of my sea daddies and naval mentors, and a great man and a wonderful human being as well. And he was kind of a mentor to me in a very forgiving way, because when I first arrived in Washington, I was quite an ingenue and very naive about the perils of Washington. So I got into the newspaper and in ways that should not have been career enhancing. But he would always. I was sure I was going to get fired. Like one day after I was in the front page of the Washington Post after a supposedly off the record dinner with some Foreign Service officers, and I didn't quite rant, but I heavily criticized Senator Fulbright for leaking everything that he was briefed on. And that was headlines because, as we all know, there's no such thing as an off-the-record briefing in Washington. So that was new to me. And the Secretary of State, when called President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, said, "You got to fire this guy because I've just been about to reach a real modus vivendi with Fulbright to get him to support." And so he called me and he said, "You got to get rid of this guy. He's clearly not going to help relations between us." And so I get a call from Kissinger's office, because the NSC staff was across. It was in the White House complex, but in what is now called the Eisenhower Building. So I went over to the West Wing, and sure, I was about to get fired. And Henry greeted me and said, "Lehman." He always called me Lehman. And he said, "The Secretary of State demands that you be fired." And I said, "Oh dear." Yes, I said, "I can understand that. I saw the paper this morning." And he said, "Well, I talked to the president because he had also been called by the Secretary of State. And he asked me, 'Who is this Lehman?' And so I told him, and we agreed on what must be done." He said, and I was sure what the next sentence would be, but he said, "The president and I have agreed to promote you and give you a raise." So that was Henry was really, I mean, he's a real sea daddy to me. And my career in the government would have been very short if it weren't for him And so that's why, I really, in effect, I'm doing a book on my sea daddies because there's so many junctures, great men had kept me on a course that made me want to be the head of the Navy because of the situation in the world, thanks to their mentoring. And other later sea daddies are more known naval figures because I had become very good friends with Bud Zumwalt and when he became CNO, and I was still happily still on the White House staff.
Mm-hmm.
And he, in many ways, but again, it's a long and interesting story, but you'll have to wait for the book. And
For the book, yes.
the same with Jim Holloway. Holloway was a real mentor to me and a real sea daddy. And obviously, being on the National Security Council so soon after my graduate work, to be able to actually go through basic and advanced jet pilot training was not going to happen if I did not have help from within. And it made it much harder for me because to make sure that that I was not able to be criticized for cutting corners.
Mm-hmm.
I went through a much harder, grueling schedule of flight training than the ordinary. I obviously, with the complications of my civilian job, it took me a while to get through flight training because I had to wait till there was a leave of absence when Kissinger was on one or another really big trips. But I had the advantage of sea daddies who could make sure, as normally happens in flight training, you're pooled for weeks and weeks at a time as they build up a specific part of the syllabus. I never had to go through that. I always had 2 flights a day, but I paid the price for that with having the most grueling NATOPS exams and flight tests. And I think every circuit breaker in every airplane I was tested in was pulled, and I had to recover from it. So it really was good, but it was tough, but I loved it.
You are listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategies podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This season is produced with support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients, including the Department of Defense, in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. Here at CMS, our whole team uses Dataminr's First Alert to stay up to date on breaking news or crises that impact our national security or the security of our allies and partners.
Absolutely. And all of this, and then once the Carter administration shows up, you do some consulting, you write this wonderful first book here about aircraft carriers. How does all of this then in turn prepare you to be the Secretary of the Navy in 1981? You've had a great lead up to that, but could you talk a little bit about that as well? How does all this prepare you to be the SecNav when you step into the job as arguably one of the youngest holders of the position in history too? Mm-hmm.
Well, the 8 years I spent with Kissinger was the greatest possible education in geopolitics, and then the real role and value of the Navy in keeping the peace and defending the country, and that all too often, and it was what really it motivated me because of the concerns I had by even starting in high school. That's why I majored in international relations in
Absolutely.
college, because I felt that the presidents we had, including Republican ones, did not really get it, how much of an island nation we are that is fundamentally dependent on command of the seas. And so that's why I wanted to go to Washington. That's why I then went to Cambridge and to Penn to get the credentials to. I really felt I wanted to get down and then get involved in changing it. So the 4 years after or during the Carter administration, I still didn't leave the Navy because
Right.
I was a consultant to the CNO, and I was a consultant to on a pro bono basis to the Senate Armed Services Committee. Scoop Jackson,
Mm.
a Democrat from Washington, one of the great men, and John Tower, who were in many ways my important sea daddies as well, because we worked very closely during those Carter years to defend the Navy on the Hill. I was doing it in a non-paid status, but they became absolutely indispensable, along with Dick Allen and Vice President Bush, in me getting the job, because it had already been promised to a very big donor by the Reagan staff, and it was quite a fight. So there's a chapter on it right there in your Command of the Seas. So
Yeah, right there.
so you'll have to read it to get the real blood curdling sense of what happened. But so I learned a lot during that period, continuing to learn, continuing to do my active duty in the fleet. I actually was never assigned. Once I got my wings to a reserve unit, I flew with the medium attack wing at Oceana as a reserve augment. So you had to stay up to the same level of training as the active duty, but you didn't have all of the dare I say, chicken shit, which is maybe
That's
bleep.
okay. No, we won't bleep that.
That our poor aviators have to go through in all the services. They're filling out 722 by actual count annual reports to committees that don't even exist anymore in the Pentagon, but they've never been sunsetted. So, and then there's a combined federal campaign and all kinds of ridiculous bureaucratics. I really feel sorry for our operators in all the services that are plagued with the effects of this vast bureaucracy that sits on top of them. And 970,000 civilians in the Pentagon. I mean, they're not all fit in the Pentagon for sure, but they produce all this make work. Well, I didn't have any of that because I was a reserve augment. All I had to do was stay up with them, up with the active duty aviators by flying, which I did at least 2 weekends a month, and usually a month in the summer.
And yes, and actually a number of historians credit you and John McCain for your work during the Carter administration of handshaking and talking to members on the Hill to convince them to finally support the funding for the fourth Nimitz-class carrier. So all that work offline certainly paid massive dividends as we move into the 1980s. We're getting a little shorter on time. Let me ask you one final question to help kind of pull some of this together. You were the driving force behind the 600 ship Navy concept, and you effectively mated it to the maritime strategy that developed over the 1970s that you helped to develop as well. Looking ahead, and part of our discussion here, of course, is looking ahead to the Navy's future from 250 onward. Considering all the changes that have occurred to the fleet, in that time, we've gone from nearly 600 ships down to 297. The last Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, at one point said something like, "I'm still trying to operate with John Lehman's Navy." Well, of course, because it was a good one and it was built to last. And it's served the nation well. So, in looking back at your experience with the maritime strategy and the 600 ship Navy, what does the Navy need to do now as we drive forward into the next 250 years? And how would you outline some of those choices for the Navy?
Well, it's a very daunting period for the whole country. As we know, it's polarized politically, and it's a very difficult time, particularly with the rise of the bureaucracy and its religion of jointness. You're not allowed to even mention the Navy. It's the joint force now, and that's it's an idea that is defensible, except that it's been turned into a cult and an empowering doctrine for the faceless bureaucracy. And so everything has to be joint. Every new weapon is subject to the Defense Resources Oversight Committee, the JROC, which is supposed to be able to say how fast Navy ships should go and how high Air Force airplanes should fly, and so instead of, the Air Force built the Minuteman in 4 years, the Navy built the first Polaris boat, missile, warhead, and guidance systems in 4 years from the back of an envelope. Today, it takes, by law, it takes 5.5 years to get the back of an envelope, to get an agreed agreement, a joint force agreement to build something or to improve something or to change something. So all of that bureaucracy has resulted in disaster after disaster in shipbuilding, with the new destroyer canceled, with the LCS canceled, with the new carrier, which is basically the same Nimitz hull, but with all new kind of technologies. But it costs, adjusted for inflation, 3 times what a Nimitz class carrier costs. Who's responsible for any of these? And I think they're about to cancel the new frigate, and that's another story. And who's responsible? Nobody's ever been fired or disciplined. There is no accountability because there's no single authority anymore. It's the faceless joint bureaucracy. So you can't fire that. But okay, that's what's wrong. That's what's bad. But we showed in the 80s that things were, at least in many ways, as bad. Recruiting, we couldn't recruit, we couldn't retain, and yet we turned it around in 6 months. And that is the genius of the very special nature of the United States. It's a culture, it's an attitude, it's an economy for all of its faults, and it's a government that, for all of its faults and all of its misjudgments and so forth, is the greatest ever in history. And we can respond and will respond. Unfortunately, today, it's virtually every war we've ever gotten into, every serious war, we've been kicked around for the first year.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of kids die because of lack of preparedness. And so we have that problem, and we have to make it clear, as President Reagan did, and the bipartisan Democrats and Republican leaders in the Congress, that we were on the mend. As in 1981, it was announced, it was funded, and it deterred. We did not end up in war, even though we were very poorly prepared for any showdown with the Soviet Union. But right away, deterrence began to kick in because it was clear we were not going to allow these disparities in favor of the Soviet potential aggressors. And we can do that again. We can fix the problems. And again, you don't do this by moving around organization charts. We have to have leaders in both the uniformed Navy and the civilian Navy and Defense Department. And leadership can solve all these problems. It's going to take some time, but just throwing money at it is not the solution, because with the current structure we have, throwing more money at it just makes it worse and locks in a totally dysfunctional system for personnel and for acquisition and for good policy making. So I still, believe it or not, after all these sins that I've recounted, I'm very much of an optimist that we can recover. We just need people to step forward, and it's got to be a bipartisan recovery. That there's, without any doubt, every poll I've ever seen, we have about 80% of Americans who want to do the right thing. They're not ideologues. They need leadership. They need a program. They need a strategy to recover, and so that will happen sooner or later. Hopefully sooner, so we don't end up in a shooting war.
Absolutely agree. And ladies and gentlemen, our listeners, you can read more about what Secretary Lehman has been talking about in these many books that you see here right before you. If you want a great snapshot into the 1980s as well, there's a wonderful C-SPAN video, 17 March 1987, the two-carrier buy. Hearings in the Senate Armed Services Committee. It's got the all-stars of sea power, including Secretary Lehman, an all-star Senate Armed Services Committee, and you'll get an actual explanation as to what a block buy is for the first time. I think this is like the earliest on video that I've seen where you explain that. And you also give a wonderful explanation of the 1980s maritime strategy and 600-ship Navy. So I encourage folks to check that out as well. And we'll have to have you back for yet another episode. We're going to look forward to seeing that book on Sea Daddies that's coming out. That's going to be awesome. And folks, that's a wrap. A huge thank you to Secretary Lehman for joining us at Maritime Nation to talk naval history and the way forward. I would very much like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. If you have not heard our previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify or Apple Podcast. Episode and all content described here today can be found on our website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org. Thanks to Dataminr for their sponsorship and support, and stay tuned for our next episode. And again, thank you, John, for appearing with us today. Always a wonderful event.
Thank you. You're a great interviewer.
Thank you.